Thank you very much for having me. And Peter, you did an excellent job on covering the biology. And I will begin to try to cover some of the issues that we have as beekeepers in trying to control this pest. And so let me share my screen. There we go. Okay. So I'll talk a bit about detection and then more about control and how the average beekeeper is dealing with this pest globally. And thanks, Peter, for setting up so we understand the biology, or we understand some about the biology of this pest. First of all, in seeing the presentation from Reunion, you were looking through the whole hive and looking frame by frame for the beetle. And that certainly is a way, but it's very time consuming. And even with that intensive method, you can miss beetles in the hive, low levels of beetles. And Mark Schaefer and Peter and I and others published this thing where you could slide a small piece of plastic, corrugated plastic in the hive and get some idea of the number of beetles, because beetles are moving either on the top bars or the bottom of the hive. And it's a fairly good and quick sampling method. We don't have an absolute sampling method that works efficiently. So knowing whether you have the beetle or not is not 100%. Even with the evidence that I saw where you're going frame by frame in the hive, it's difficult to detect low levels of beetles. And Peter's already touched on this. Certainly package bees and queen movement around the globe and wax, as he's clearly shown, is having an effect. But I want to show this picture. These are small mating nukes where queens are mated in the US. And this is one of the major places where we have problems in beekeeping in the US, is these small mating nukes are very vulnerable to small hive beetle. And so the beekeepers there have to constantly fight against invasion in these mating nukes for queens. Where we have more of an issue and where the beekeepers, when they first encounter a small hive beetle, is in the honey house. You have low levels of beetles in your hive. This is wonderful. You have low levels of beetles, adult beetles here in your hive, but you pull the honey supers and you bring them into a honey house and you don't extract them for some amount of time. If you have brood in those honey supers or pollen, brood or pollen, they need protein. There will be adult beetles in that harvested honey. They'll begin to reproduce, and then you get this slimy appearance on your honey and on throughout these boxes. So it's actually very simple. In Africa, in areas where people have small hive beetle and they're endemic, you just extract the honey rapidly, 2 to 4 days, and you can prevent this problem. So as beetles move into a new area, one of the first places as a beekeeper you might encounter the problem is not in your hives per se with mass reproduction, but you may notice damage to your stored honey. So be aware of that and extract honey in a short time period. There's one other part of this that I'm going to show about in a honey house, the beetles love high humidity. And I did some work on egg hatch and humidity, and the eggs are very susceptible to dry conditions. So this was a simple experiment. We can get small hive beetles to lay eggs on these dual glass slides. So they lay them between the glass slides. And you can see that these are the white eggs. We simply held these freshly laid eggs at different relative humidities, 6 different relative humidities. And then the eggs hatch in 24 to 48 hours. And we simply count the percent of egg hatch. So here's some nice, a magnified view of very healthy, newly laid small hive beetle eggs. If they're subjected to dry conditions, they dry or desiccate. And there's even yolk still left in here, but they won't hatch. And if they do hatch, it's very easy to see that these eggs were successful. These all hatched. So we just simply looked at egg hatch versus relative humidity. And it was very, very clear, somewhere around 50%, this is about a 50% line, somewhere around 50% and less humidity, the eggs almost don't develop. And above that, the higher the humidity, the greater the success in hatching. So beekeepers in certain areas can use a dehumidifier or an air conditioner where they're storing their honey and reduce the chance of small hive beetle damage. But in general, beetles love humidity for a variety of reasons, and certainly the eggs do better in high humidity. So again, simple, bring your honey in and extract it right away. If you can't, move air and dry that air below 50% humidity, and you can protect stored honey from small hive beetle damage. This is what Peter was talking about, mass reproduction. In the bottom of this picture, I hate to guess how many larvae there are there present, in the thousands. And this is what we talk about, mass reproduction. Given that a hive is abandoned, or that the bees have left, or the beekeeper, it goes queenless and there's brood, the beetles will begin to reproduce, and the larvae congregate, and they mass in the hive on the bottom board or in the frames, and they do all move out at once, as Peter mentioned. As a beekeeper, that gives us an opportunity. We come to a dead hive in the apiary, we open it up, and there's larval damage. Well, you can use soapy water, and in this case, this is soapy water in the picture, soapy water or bleach to kill the larvae. Just collect the hive, shake out the larvae into a bath and kill them. Maybe treat the soil around there if you think some larvae have already come out. And also, you can freeze the combs if there's still larvae present in the combs. But we don't let dead hives sit in the apiary. But this mass reproduction, it's more common, as Peter mentioned, as beekeepers get used to dealing with small hive beetles, and as the beetles move into new areas. So we don't understand exactly why, but it probably has to do with, we have large colonies of Apis mellifera, a lot of resources, and the resources are simply brood and pollen. They can survive on honey, but they need brood or pollen, the protein, to reproduce. I'll say a little bit about traps. There's a number of traps that have been tried, and the ones you see pictured, none of them work that great. And with all due apologies to Dr. Hood, this is one that he developed. It catches some beetles. This is one on the bottom board. You fill it with oil. It's kind of impractical. It catches a lot of beetles, but it's very impractical on a broad scale. This is a little corrugated plastic that the beetles crawl into, and they come into contact with Coumaphos in this case, or there's other poisons that you can put in this trap to kill beetles on the bottom board. I actually don't like any of these traps. What we have been using is these beetle blaster traps. And I think that's probably what you were putting in the wild hive in the presentation earlier, I'm guessing, was perhaps something like this beetle blaster trap. You put a bait in there and the beetles move in. But for me, the most encouraging way that we found to fight hive beetles is a simple towel. It's a disposable fibrous towel, and I'll show you another picture here in just a minute in the next slide. You place these across the top bars or on the bottom board, and guess what happens? The beetles are trying to get away from the adult bees. They move into these towels, and then they literally get stuck. They just get stuck in the towels. They can't come out and ask the bees to feed them. They're stuck, and they starve to death. So these are working very efficiently. I don't know exactly how efficiently, but they're very satisfying from a beekeeper standpoint. You put them in the top and the bottom. You catch a lot of beetles. You take them out and replace them. You notice the bees propolize along here because they're trying to fight the beetles as well. But these towels or Swiffer towels are very effective. And it also is a very good way. In fact, it would be a very good survey tool. You put these in all of your, what did you call them? Not the 5 kilometer zone, but that other zone. put these in the top or bottom board of a lot of hives around Reunion. And if there's beetles there, they'll find these howls. So it probably could be developed as a nice survey tool as well, but no one's done that to my knowledge yet, or not quantified it. But these howls are very effective for control. So just kind of summarizing some things, how we've been dealing, or other people around the globe have been dealing with small hive beetle. In the honey house, you extract rapidly, and you also, if you use queen excluders, you can prevent honey and pollen, you can prevent brood and pollen from being in most of that stored honey. So I like using queen excluders where small hive beetles are a problem. If you have the opportunity, you can reduce the humidity in the honey house, as I already talked about. Also, when these larvae, when they start moving to the ground, they're attracted to light for some reason. And you can put, if in your honey house, you can put a small light at night, and you can attract larvae into some kind of trap and kill them. Wet supers, after the honey is extracted, wet supers could contain small amounts of pollen and or brood. Get those back on bees so they can clean them up. And if necessary, if you've got a small hive beetle problem, you can treat the soil right around the honey house. You can also treat the soil around hives that have been damaged. And that's the use of some pyrethroid insecticides where you drench the soil. I'm not a big fan of that. I don't do that in my own operation. I manage about 100 hives. I see small hive beetles every day, and I simply try to pick up and weak colonies or combine them, and I don't have problems in my honey house. So that's mostly honey house and management. Other ways that beekeepers are dealing with small hive beetles. It sounds obvious that you keep strong hives, but weak hives, not that they're more attractive or more, but they are more susceptible. A weak hive that's queenless, would have trouble defending itself against beetles, and you get damage. So watch for weak hives in your operation. Peter touched on this. You want the highest number of bees in the colony, and you don't want excess comb. You don't want a lot of extra supers. You don't want a bunch of empty frames where the beetles can hide. This becomes really important if you're making divisions or splits. If you make a nucleus colony and you take out brood and bees, make sure you have extra bees in that split to help protect that brood, because it's very vulnerable as you make that split. Use in-hive traps. I like this. Certainly the beetle blaster works. And that helps you just keep the adult beetle population down. You can treat the soil, but I'm not a big fan of that unless you know you come to a dead colony, you can tell that the larvae have already left, then it would be efficient to treat the soil around that colony. That would be a way. And something we haven't touched on, we believe we understand why, but beetles, if you have one hive in the shade and one hive in the sun in the same apiary, the hive in the shade will always have more beetles in it. The beetles tend to migrate to hives that are in the shade. Maybe it has something to do with humidity. We don't know, but certainly you'll see that in your own apiary if you learn to deal with small hive beetle, that shaded colonies harbor more beetles. So place them in full sun if it's not too hot. And lastly, I'm going to make some comments on Reunion, or my thoughts on Reunion. First of all, based on the fact that it was found in July of 22, I suspect that small hive beetles are present in the wild colonies. And I think that evidence was just presented. You found five wild hives in 2 hours. First of all, that says there's a lot of wild hives on Reunion in the trees, in the forest. Small hive beetle, there's no reason to assume it's not in the wild population. There's every reason to assume that it is present. So continuing to kill managed colonies while you can't control the wild population it makes no sense. There's no logic behind it. So I think the effort should switch from eradication to education and learning to work with the beetle. I don't know what benefit eradication is doing for this particular pest, simply because I also don't think this particular pest is the end of beekeeping. It hasn't been that way in any population it's moved into. The beekeepers still continue to keep hives. And I would rank it certainly below Varroa, American foul brood, and European foul brood. And even I'd rate it below wax moth in terms of the amount of damage it can do to equipment. When you lose whole hives and things to wax moth, you lose a lot of value. And small hive beetles, you can even recycle the combs and things. So it's a pest. It's something I wish we didn't have in the US, but we're certainly dealing with it. So I think the beekeepers of Reunion can learn to deal with this pest. You do have ideal conditions. I will say that. You have ideal humidity and temperature, but there's good examples from Florida, the Hawaiian Islands, and even places like Brazil where we can learn to deal with it. I'll close with a comment. When the beetle first moved into Hawaii, and I was there for part of that introduction, I didn't help the introduction, but it moved into Hawaii. It caused damage. Some beekeepers lost hives. There was mass reproduction in certain areas. As the beekeepers become more aware, learn to deal with it, those mass reproduction and colony losses have declined in Hawaii. And they have a very, very active queen ring group in Hawaii. So they've got tropical environment in Hawaii, just like Reunion, and they're learning to deal with that pest. So I would say education over eradication would be my take-home message for dealing with it on Reunion. And with that, merci beaucoup. And I'll answer questions if I can. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Jeff, pour ta présentation. Alors, du coup, quelques questions. Une personne qui demande si on peut utiliser l'acide formique, comme c'est utilisé pour Varroa.
Not really. In fact, I mean, if you're using formic acid for Varroa control, you're probably getting reasonable control. But for me, trapping the adult beetles, and you can even use some chemically laced traps on the bottom board where the bees can't get to the chemical, but the beetles can, to kill adult beetles. The pyrethroids that you can use in the ground are effective where you've had problems, but formic acid treatment itself, probably, I don't know of any evidence that it's highly effective in controlling small hive beetles. And again, it actually probably disrupts the hive a bit. You actually might have a window there where the small hive beetles can become active, the disruption that formic acid would have on the overall hive. So no, I don't know, maybe Peter knows. Peter, any evidence of?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. We did a study on the formic acid, on the organic acids in US, and smaller beetles love the dispensers. The device where the acid comes out and the beetles were hiding underneath the dispensers, even though the concentration of the acid was probably the highest around the dispensers. So the answer is a straight no, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Donc une question sur la température et le temps de congélation du matériel de la ruche, et une autre personne aussi qui demandait si on pouvait soufrer, enfin mettre du soufre.
I would say no to sulfur simply because of the potential to contaminate honey, and that honey is a food product. So I would stay away from sulfur. I use bleach. If I find larvae on my bottom boards, I just poured concentrated bleach directly on my bottom boards because it kills the larvae. It kind of it acts as a disinfectant, and it becomes inactive, a short time in contact with air. Soapy water also works, but no, I would stay away from sulfur. I mean, I guess maybe you're thinking sulfur for adult beetles, and I would stay away from sulfur because of the contamination of the honey product. Oh, and on the freezing temperatures. I would go 48 hours, get it into a freezer and hold for 48 hours, just to be sure. The larvae tend to aggregate in the combs, as you see in that bottom picture, and it might take a little bit. The adults in particular are very susceptible to cold. if you see a dead hive in the winter, and I had a few this winter, although my losses were really light this winter. I go into a very small hive. It only has 3 frames of bees, but it's gotten small and it's died. Right in the middle of the cluster is, let's say, 100 beetles. They were seeking warmth and they've died as well. So the beetles themselves can't survive winter temperatures. They can't survive probably much below 10 or down below 5 degrees. So they depend on the bees to keep them warm through the winter in temperate zones, not so much in tropical zones. But yeah, the beetles are susceptible to cold.
Très bien. Une autre question, enfin plusieurs questions au sujet des serviettes Swiffer. Donc une première question qui demandait si elles peuvent être utilisées comme filtre HEPA. Je ne sais pas trop de quoi il s'agit, mais vous devez savoir.
Too expensive. No, I just look around. I don't know this. This one's called Dixie, and it's only 2-ply. It's kind of actually it's not even 2-ply. It's a single sheet, and I fold it over. But I don't know if you can see, it's got little openings in it. It's fibrous, but no, HEPA filter is going to be too expensive. There's something, you have something that you can access, and our bee supply people sell these because they do need to be fibrous for the beetles to get inside them.
La question, c'est si ça pouvait les remplacer, je pense. Je me suis peut-être mal exprimé. Ça pouvait remplacer ces filtres. Donc, enfin, on est en train de solution moins chère.
But my thought is that HEPA filters are going to be expensive. I mean, HEPA filters are expensive. Look for something that's like this. HEPA filter is similar to this, but HEPA filters are expensive. There's these disposable towels that are really cheap, really inexpensive. Yeah. What we need is Peter, you need a good master's student. We need to know how this compares to the Schaefer trap and to visual inspection. I think this could be a very easy diagnostic tool. I think, yeah. You're on mute, Peter. Yeah.
Sorry, Jeff, I don't want to disturb. No, but sure, that's a good idea. Let's do a master's topic on this. I'm going to ES soon in June, so we can do it. Actually, we're going to Maryland. Looking forward to see you if you're there.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, absolutely. Please keep me in mind, and I'm happy to supervise a master's student. We can check that out, what the efficacy actually is. But the pictures are quite impressive.
Yeah.
The numbers are probably high, yeah.
Donc, plusieurs questions toujours autour des serviettes. Donc, est-ce que les abeilles vont détruire les serviettes?
Simply because the bees help the process. There's my share screen. The bees actually help the process. The bees chew the edge of the towel. Like here, this edge of the towel is chewed and it's more fibrous. The beetles are hiding in there, and yet it's on their legs and their tarsi on their feet, they get entangled in the fabric. And then these are a little bit older, and this has got a lot of propolis. So given enough time, the towels kind of become ineffective. They become filled up with beetles, and they become propolized. So I go in and try to replace them once a month. Whenever I'm in the hive, I'll scrape the old ones off and put new ones on. So they're nice, they're simple, they're cheap, and you can help keep the adult beetles down with these devices. It's very simple. I wouldn't discount these beetle blasters also, but you put them in between the frames. You put a bait in there, apple cider vinegar or beer, and the beetles crawl in and they drown. I put a small bit of oil in there as well.
Jeff, it's a waste of beer.
Yeah.
Well, but I don't know about the efficacy of those traps. We know very little. We don't even know about the cardboard traps, about those.
Of these, we don't know how effective they are. No.
Exactly. So these numbers here, the pictures you show me, Jeff, are very impressive.
So
really, it looks very promising. Yeah.
I don't know the efficacy of these either. I just know that I have less beetles than you see pictured here. I have, in the average hive, I have, let's say 10 to 50 beetles. And if I use these, I can keep reducing the numbers.
Yeah, you have the Maryland advantage.
Yeah. Anyway, go ahead. Other questions about the towels? Yeah, I replace them. I replace them maybe once a month, 3 times, 4 times during a year.
D'accord. Est-ce qu'il y a des fibres qui sont retrouvées dans les produits de ruches, vu que les abeilles, du coup, détachent les fibres, etc. Est-ce qu'elles vont en emmener non.
I don't know that anyone's looked at it, but well, if you look, they tend to, this is the edge that they were propolizing. They begin to chew it. The bees want to remove foreign material in the hive. So they're chewing the towel here. And when they can't remove it, they then begin to propolize it. So I don't think fibers in the hive would be a significant problem, but I don't know that for sure. Yeah. And it's not it's not asbestos. It's simply a cotton poly fiber.
Bien. Une autre question au niveau des différences entre les larves de la teigne, de la fausse teigne et du PCR.
So I didn't have a picture. Wax moth larvae in general, when they're mature, are almost twice the size. Small hive beetles are smaller. They have little spines along the top parts, and they'll be in the comb and they'll be in the slime. You'll see them in the corners. Let's see, here they are. They're smaller than wax moth. The other key is that wax moth larvae leave a cocoon, a tunnel, as they tunnel through the wax, and you see little bits of black. It's actually poop we call frass. But if the wax moth were here in this comb, they would leave a little tunnel and silk that you could see. Whereas small hive beetle, there's no wax. I mean, there's no cocoon, there's no fibers or silk, and there's simply slime and the exposed larvae. And they do have a set of ridges, little spines down their back, but they're fairly easy to tell apart. Obviously, small, young wax moth larvae would be the similar size to mature small hive beetle larvae, but you can tell them apart.
Très bien, merci. Une autre question, du coup, est-ce que vous avez une idée des pourcentages d'efficacité des pièges? Et donc, il y a 3 questions en une. Est-ce que vous avez constaté une perte de production des ruches avant et après l'infestation? Est-ce que vous avez un ordre d'idée de cette perte? Et la dernière question, c'est si le PCR fait fermenter le miel des colonies, comment les abeilles font pour survivre à l'hivernage? Enfin, comment les colonies?
Okay, I'll try to cover all those. So this trap on the bottom with Coumaphos, or there's another compound which is highly deadly to bees that they use to bait this. These traps are fairly efficient, but I don't know. Again, it's hard to do control studies on the efficacy against adult beetles because you don't know how many adult beetles you had and stuff. So I don't know of any really good studies showing the total efficacy. It's really hard. The same with this beetle blaster. You have you catch beetles. The same with these, you catch beetles, but how efficient? Nothing is going to trap all the beetles. So I think none of the traps are perfectly, it just helps you in the battle. It's better to focus on keeping the hive strong and not letting dead or weak colonies create this mass reproduction. There was something, the last part of the question was a simple answer. Now I've forgotten the question. So maybe repeat the last 2 parts of the question. I've forgotten what the...
Donc, avez-vous constaté une perte de production avant et après l'infestation du PCR et de combien à peu près, s'il y a une ordre d'idée?
Yep. I would say it's hard to quantify. When beetle numbers do get high in the colony, the bees are spending a lot of time defending against beetles, and it could disrupt the overall high performance. But in general, you don't see, like, if you have light to moderate beetle infestation, you're having lower honey production. We don't see that. The damage is if you let beetles get out of hand with mass reproduction, then you're losing some hives. That's the problem. And then you're reinfesting your other hives. But no, as far as it's unlike Varroa, I would say, in this sense. Varroa, we know here's this level, you're going to get some damage. A little bit higher Varroa, you're going to get more damage on overwintering and survival and stuff. Small hive beetles, there's not that same level of understanding of how they do affect hives. And they don't eat much honey. They actually beg food, as Peter showed. They beg food from the workers in the hive. They use a lot of, they beg food from the workers. They can feed on honey, but they really prefer, the females want to feed on pollen and bee brood. And one last thing about this and about longevity, I've held beetles on honey and water for over a year. They can live a long time. So they're very, they can live a long time on just honey. So but they're not in your hive, like stealing your honey, and they're not getting to the numbers where the amount of feeding that they're doing is doing damage unless they get to pollen and bee brood. Then they're doing damage. Peter, would you agree on that we don't know the damage level? Like if you have, I mean, other than the fact of losing hives, as far as I don't know of any evidence of reduction in production by the hives.
No, I'm not aware of reports that, in contrast to Varroa, I'm not aware that, smaller beetle is known to reduce reproduction. Because I've seen hives in, like, for example, in New Zealand and Australia, the bottom board was black with thousands of beetles. So then, rather it's not a matter of production, it's a matter of live or die. So these colonies, and then, I went to an apiary and I thought it's a swarming season. No, the colonies just was flying away. So I went to an apiary and there were the trees where 3, 4, 5 swarms of bees just running away from the beetles. That is the problem, not the productivity, but rather that colonies are basically thrown out of their house because the bees run away. So yeah, I think that's the main problem, that the colonies are basically lost for the beekeeper. That's the point, not the reduced honey yield.
Yeah. So another thing to keep in mind with small hive beetle, I'm putting it down here as far as a pest. I'm putting Varroa up here. Varroa we know can impact production, survival, and everything else. American foul brood, highly contagious. You need to burn hives. It lowers production and things like that. European foul brood the same way. So I put all those much higher on the damage threshold and danger level than small hive beetle. It's a pest. It's something that you have to deal with, and but in general, we can learn to deal with it. But there is a learning curve, and as it moves into new areas.
No, absolutely. I'm totally with you, Jeff. I can only support you that you have to adjust your management. Keep especially the honey house clean, keep the apiary clean, extract honey early, and all these traps, they are a little help. But as long as the bees have access to all parts of the hive and the colonies are strong, it shouldn't be a big issue, especially not with those bees in La Réunion. If Apis mellifera unicolor is from Madagascar, we have smaller beetles in Madagascar in the first place. So this makes a very big difference, compared to France. In France, you have French European honeybees. In La Réunion, you have African honeybees. So these bees there, I would bet they are much better able to deal with Aethina tumida. I've just been to Brazil, where we have Africanized bees, and the colonies are perfectly fine with small hive beetle. They have a few beetles here and there, but it's not a drama. Yes, you can do beekeeping with small hive beetles, no problem. I'm pretty sure about that. You have to learn from other areas, but that won't be a big drama. I'm pretty sure.
Un peu dans la lignée de vos remarques, du coup, une personne, je pense, de l'ANSES qui demande si, vu que c'est une zone localisée où on retrouve le coléoptère pour l'instant à La Réunion, et que, si on met en place une surveillance des ruchers sauvages, est-ce que, d'après vous, ils veulent avoir votre avis, du coup, sur est-ce que il y a encore une chance d'éradiquer bel et bien Aethina tumida, ou il faut passer à un autre mode de gestion?
Well, I mean, it's just a personal opinion. I don't think eradication is possible. If you had found that first introduction, and then you looked around and found no more, but you found like up to 13 now in 13 different apiaries, and you found it in the wild hives. If you can find 5 wild hives in 2 hours in the forest, there's a large population of wild hives on Reunion, and you can't control that population. And that's always going to be a reservoir. And you've got lychee, and you've got other fruits being grown. You've got other places that beetles can live. You could kill all the island, kill all the bees on the south end of the island. You still have the wild hives, and you have fruit, things that beetles can survive on. So I think, I mean, it's just a personal opinion, but eradication at this point is impossible.
I echo, Jeff, I echo you absolutely. You also have stingless bees on La Réunion, or do you? If yes, you have additional hosts of small live beetle. Yeah. So absolutely, like I have a bit of a déjà vu, because I was asked in 2000 from the federal government of Australia whether all honeybee colonies in New South Wales should be eradicated. And I asked them, please have a look at your feral colonies. If you find smaller beetle in feral colonies, it's too late, because it's impossible to find each and every feral honeybee colony. You can destroy all managed honeybee colonies in New South Wales, but you cannot destroy all feral honeybee colonies in New South Wales, because the odd swarm will survive. So I guess the situation is fairly similar in La Réunion. That's also my personal opinion.
I'm going to add one more comment to that. And my comment, or my question to the authorities in France or wherever in Réunion, what are you protecting the beekeepers from? In my opinion, you're protecting them from small hive beetle, which is not the end of the world. So it's at the beginning, it made sense. Maybe we didn't know the extent of the infestation, or where they were, or could they be in the wild population. Once you've determined that they're in multiple locations, even though you've taken these measures, and now they're in the wild population, at some point those measures need to stop. And that's, like I said, it's a personal opinion. Because what are you protecting the beekeepers from? It's not the end. Small hive beetle is not the end of the world. It's all over the globe. We don't like it. We don't like it in areas where we have it, but we're not out of business.
Ensuite, pourrait-on, donc, il permet de savoir, une fois que vous trouvez une ruche infestée, quels sont du coup les protocoles que vous mettez en place?
Well, again, I think currently, I guess they're still destroying hives within an apiary, and maybe all the hives within an apiary. I know they did this in parts of Italy for a while. I would encourage continued monitoring and methods to reduce the adult beetle population. Just move from eradication to management. But I would also say, I don't know the trade between Réunion and mainland France, but I would be very careful about that. I would look at, are there any avenues where people are allowed free movement between mainland France and Réunion that would encourage beetle movement? So I would look at that closely, wax trade or anything else, because in essence, you're the same country. But I would make sure I was protecting that distance. I would look at that, look at what you're doing trade-wise. Is there any movement of bees or wax or anything, and make sure you prevent that. But for Réunion, I think it should move to management. Management means to simply work to lower beetle populations.
Jeff, you have made a very good point, because La Réunion is part of France. So
Yeah.
no movement of bees and wax whatsoever from La Réunion to France, because that would be a big danger of introducing Aethina tumida to France. But on the other hand, I guess, education seems better than eradication, that the beekeepers should really learn from US colleagues, from Australian colleagues, how to deal with the beetle. I get this in the long run, the way forward. And again, I think there's a big hope that the bees of La Réunion are they're very African, so they should have less of a problem now.
Donc, plusieurs autres questions. Déjà, une question sur est-ce que les bourdons et les abeilles solitaires sont impactés par le PCR? Est-ce qu'il y a déjà eu des études sur ce sujet?
Dr. Neumann, yeah. Well, the honest question is we don't really know. There are a few, let's say that reports suggesting that stingless bees can do very well with Aethina tumida, because when in honeybees and bumblebees, when they attack the beetle makes a turtle, and then they leave the beetle alone. Stingless bees are more persistent. Stingless bees stay with them, and they cover them while the beetle is turtling. They cover the beetle with kind of propolis. So stingless bees seem to be much more efficient in dealing with small hive beetle than the other bees. Bumblebees, we know, Jeff and myself, we did a few experiments back in the Dorothy Hoffman days, and we only observed the colonies for a short time. We also found them in the field, that the beetle goes in the field and can use bumblebee colonies for pollination in greenhouses, and they go in these colonies. But I'm not aware of reports that these bumblebee colonies died. So we don't know, to be quite honest. Again, indication is stingless bees probably less of an issue. For solitary bees and for bumblebees, we really don't know, especially not what's going on in the field. All the data observations we have are from laboratory experiments or from commercial colonies you can buy for greenhouse pollination. We have no clue about wild bumblebee colonies, at least as far as I know. And there are no bumblebees in in Africa south of Sahara. So this is something, a real novel host for smaller beetles. But also here the knowledge is very poor.
Très bien, merci beaucoup à vous trois pour ces différentes interventions. Je pense que du coup, on va arrêter les questions, comme il est bientôt 19h. Et voilà, je vous souhaite à tous une excellente soirée ou journée selon l'endroit où vous êtes dans le monde. Et merci beaucoup à vous tous.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Au revoir.
Au revoir. Bonsoir.
Merci, au revoir. Merci Jeff, merci Peter.
Au revoir François.
Avec plaisir.
Yeah.